Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Dwight Read. He is Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at the University of California, Los Angeles. His research interests include mathematical anthropology, the structural logic of kinship terminologies, theory of social organization, cultural evolution, and archaeological classification. He is the author of books like Artifact Classification, Human Thought and Social Organization, and How Culture Makes Us Human. So, Dr. Reed, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
All right, thank you for inviting me.
Okay, great. It's my pleasure. Okay, so today we're going to focus our conversation basically on how human sociality evolved and what part of it perhaps is biological and what is cultural. So I guess that perhaps to better understand that, we should start by discussing a little bit where it comes from and perhaps sociality in other primate species, particularly the ones that are the closest to us, like the chimpanzees. What do you think it's important for us to understand in terms of phylogeny, to have a clear picture of how our sociality evolved?
We have a fairly good idea of what's the likely ancestral form for our sociality, going back to a common ancestor with the chimpanzees and our species about 10 million years ago. So the question then is not so much what is the beginning. As we can look at the primates today, we can see the kind of social systems they have, and we have an idea of then what our ancestral forms would have been like. But as we come forward from there to the present, what kind of an evolutionary trajectory do we have? One is to say that what we have is an elaboration and building on what was already present at the primate level, that we're in a more advanced, sort of a highly social, highly intelligent ape, if you were. The other is that in that trajectory coming to the present, there were some major qualitative shifts that took place that in fact means we've entered into a form of sociality that is radically different than what we see with the primates. It's not just an elaboration of it. So that perhaps is the most fundamental question we have. Do we have sort of a gradual transition going from the primate kind of sociality and social systems to ourselves? Or is there a real sort of gap between us? And if so, how do we account for that gap?
Mm-hmm. And what are the aspects of, for example, chimpanzee sociality or sociality at the level of chimpanzee societies that are perhaps important for us to understand when dealing with the evolution of our own sociality?
Well, we just take the chimpanzees in isolation. We could talk about specific aspects of their sort of social system, their social organization, compared to ours, and see there are things that are, what in terms of what they have versus what we have. That one of the things happened with chimpanzees, you have relatively large communities of 80 to 100 individuals. It's referred to as a fission-fusion kind of social organization, highly sort of pro-social kind of behaviors, individuals working with other individuals to establish relations and taking advantages of those. So one can see things like that that seem to be indicative of going from there to us. But we should also stand back and ask not just what is a chimpanzee form of social organization more broadly, as we're going phylogenetically from the old world monkeys to the chimpanzees, what is the trajectory we see there? And if that trajectory, does that trajectory translate into one that you just move it forward to us? Or is there something about that trajectory that already indicates there is a real problem in moving forward to us? And of course, the argument I'm making is that the trajectory going from the old world monkeys to the chimpanzees does not simply move forward and to human social systems.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so, what's important? What sort of events did we get in that transition? For example, from old world monkeys to chimpanzees.
One of the, well, I think one of the major shifts that has taken place, it's well documented, but its implications have not been discussed very much in the primate literature.
Right.
And this is throughout the primates, we start with the prosimians coming forward to the old world monkeys, coming forward to the chimpanzees. And the theme that runs through all of this is increased individualization of behavior. Prosimians are characterized as basically having sort of two behaviors that another prosimian has to worry about. Is it a friendly or antagonistic individual, and reacting in terms of one of those two kinds of behaviors. But as we're coming forward to the chimpanzees, to old world monkeys, then the kinds of behaviors become much more elaborate and much broader, much more individualization behaviors coming in. As we come forward to the chimpanzees, they've been characterized as saying that they're very much like us in terms of being highly individualistic behaviors. So coming forward then from the old world monkeys to the chimpanzees, sort of almost a huge elaboration of the individualization of behavior. People refer to the primatologists refer to the chimpanzees as being like humans in terms of being as individualistic in terms of behaviors as humans are. The importance of this is that individualized behavior makes the social world more complex. Prosimians can basically assume, just understand every other individual in the group, basically, are they friendly or antagonistic? Sort of, I have to worry only about two behaviors if I'm a prosimian. Of course, coming forward to the old world monkeys, then it's a greater range, and to chimpanzees, a real problem, being very problematic, becomes highly individualistic. So I could work out my behavior with one individual, but I don't know that if I act to another individual in the same way, whether the other individual will act in the way I might expect them to act. And that's the problem with the individualization of behaviors that makes the social world far more complex.
Because it renders individual behavior more flexible.
More flexible and unpredictable. Mm-hmm. I don't know how sort of my fellow community members are necessarily going to react, and I can't use the behavior of one to model the behavior of others. I have to work it out for each one of them. How do I interact with this individual? How might this individual react to what I do? And if you have to do that for each member of the group, then obviously you've got a very complex social world.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so, and what is the importance of an evolutionary mechanism like kin selection? What importance did it have for the evolution of sociality in primate species, or the ways by which each species structured its own society and organized it?
Well, by kin selection, of course, we need to make it clear we're talking about biological kin selection.
Sure.
Because once we're talking about humans, sometimes there's a confusion when one says kin selection. Are we talking about kin as in the sense that we understand kin, or are we referring to the biology? So we really should be saying biological kin selection. And of course, that's one of the main mechanisms within the primate world for increasing sociality or prosocial behavior. That is, interacting circumstances increasing the likelihood of interacting with your close biological kin, which then makes it possible, as we know, for behaviors to be directed towards that individual. Whether I'm consciously aware of it or not isn't important, but as long as I'm directing my behaviors towards my biological kin, then there can be selection for those behavior if it's increasing fitness either in a direct or an indirect way. So it's a very powerful device in terms of seeing how sociality increases. But individualization of behavior is the antithesis of kin selection. Kin selection is saying, here are behaviors that are under genetic control, because that's the whole notion of selection, is what is occurring by virtue of a genetic basis. So kin selection is focusing on behaviors, prosocial behaviors that have a biological basis to them, which means that there's not a lot of variation within it. The variation is only at the genetic level. How many different genes do you have for behaviors? Would say how many different behaviors do you have? But to get individualization of behavior, you're having to move away from genetically controlled behaviors to more just propensity for kinds of behaviors. That your genes are no longer in effect telling you, here's precisely how to act, but rather saying, in a general sense, here's how you act, that you then work out specifically. In the specifics of it, you can come up with a lot of variation that doesn't have a genetic basis to it. So the development of individualized behavior is precisely saying that biological kin selection is becoming less important.
Mm-hmm. But it's due to biological kin selection that in several different primate species we get phenomena like female or male philopatry, right? That is their societies are organized basically because either the females or the males stay in their natal groups, and so societies are organized either matrilineal or in a patrilineal fashion, right?
Yes, actually, we should be a little bit careful there not to use the terms that are used for human systems like matrilineal, because there's a conceptual framework, but let's say matrilines and patrilines. Yes, absolutely. That within the old world monkeys, females are staying in their natal group. There's the males that transfer out at puberty, so that a female is with her other close biological females, her sisters, her biological cousins, the whole raft, just by virtue of the fact that they stay in place. And so if you're just simply interacting with those people in your troop, you're more likely to be interacting with your biological closer kin than if you were just reacting in general. So that kind of structure gives you the conditions for being able to interact with your kin without having to be cognitively aware this is what you're doing. You don't have to know that they're your kin. Just they are your kin because they happen to stay there in place. And so you get selection for them behaviors that are developing that kind of a social system that are very effective. Very stable dominance hierarchies in the old world monkeys. Documentation that over decades there's no change in the dominance hierarchies of females. The female puts her daughter immediately below her in the dominance hierarchy, which biologically makes sense because that gives the female mother the opportunity to establish her daughter with respect to other females. The ones initially in the dominance hierarchy would be her other daughters. And then as you go further away in the hierarchy, then you're going to other females who are more distantly related or already have a dominance. She already has a dominance relation too. So one can see it all sort of fitting together very effectively, and biological kin selection plays an important aspect of that. Come forward to the old world monkeys, or rather to the chimpanzees, and it's been documented that you don't have the same things taking place. It's the males that are staying in place. But even though males are there with each other, the pro-social kind of behaviors you get, the way in which one male interacts with another male, is not so much on the basis of interacting with their biological brothers, but rather establishing relations of male to male. That the social behaviors are less affected by biological kin selection and more being worked out through things like face-to-face interaction, which they spend a huge amount of time doing. Adult males groom each other in chimpanzees, whereas in the old world monkeys, it's mostly adult females to offspring where the grooming takes place. The mother to her offspring, the mother's biologically close sisters, and the like also with respect to the offspring is part of everyone understanding there's a newborn here and establishing relations with that offspring. But it is not adult grooming that's as important, whereas with chimpanzees, it's adult males grooming adult males as part of establishing a social relation between them. And one that's only is unstable. That keeps commenting, people comment is that the social units that the adult males can form are very unstable. They'll maybe break up within hours or days at most. And then when they re-come together, it's not the same unit that comes back together, but rather they have to reestablish a new unit. So they're spending a huge amount of time just in establishing very small social units of males interacting with each other, where they have to spend a lot of time on face-to-face interaction to make it work. And these are not stable through time. They break up, have to reform new ones. And this is part and parcel of making for a complex social organization.
Mm-hmm. And is it the case that what's at the basis of those face-to-face interactions and the relationships that individual chimpanzees establish with one another, dyadic relationships in this case, that at their basis we have reciprocal altruism as a mechanism or not?
I'd rather we leave that to the side if we can, just because it's such a hoary issue to talk about altruism, what one really means by it. I'm not sure it's helpful, but I think one could talk about it without necessarily referring to that and say that to some extent you may be getting reciprocal behaviors, but it's quite clear that you have to put a lot of time and work in terms of it. It's not just sort of, it's there, you got biological predisposition to be altruistic or whatever, and so you're now just do it as part of your biological character, but rather it seems to be, to the extent that it's there, it seems to be something that's sort of being built up out of these face-to-face interactions. And they're very interesting because they allow for kinds of behaviors where you can be dependent upon the other acting in certain ways. And I think one of the best examples would be the kind of patrolling that males do of their territory, in which they will exactly what sort of triggers it is not all that clear, but where the males will start walking one single file around the boundary of their community, and if they run into males from another community, is likely to lead into violent interaction between them, in which, in a sense, the males that are engaging in the being violent against the neighboring ones are sort of counting on that the other males will engage in it as well. So in a sense, you get some reciprocity kind of things that are going on. Whether one wants to say it's altruistic or not, it's not that important, but it's the fact that you can, through face-to-face interaction, you can get some complex behaviors like this emerging, but you have to put an enormous amount of effort into it. It's not that once you've done it, you can sit back and say, well, now we've got everything worked out, and every time we go out on a raid against our neighboring ones and start beating up on them, I can count on all these other guys that are going to do it. I don't have to worry about it in between. But rather, you can't count on them doing it. That's that fission-fusion aspect of it. Is you have to constantly be building up these relations.
Mm-hmm. So in your work, I've read that one step in the transition from chimpanzee societies, or at least the common ancestor that we had with chimpanzees, to our own societies, was the fact that we moved from a social system that was based on multi-male, multi-female societies to one that is based on pair-bonded males and females. So what's exactly the difference there? Could you explain that?
We're also talking about is many years of evolution in between, say several million years of evolution. In general, pair bonding, certainly among the primates, is relatively rare. There are pair bonded primates, but they're not very common. And generally with pair bonding, although not always, a lot of it relates to situations in which carrying of offspring is more than a single female can do by herself, or it may be a situation in which there must be sharing of resources. One can think of birds as a prime example. In order to have an egg that's being kept warm, a bird has to be on it all the time. So you can't be sitting on an egg and feeding yourself at the same time. Therefore, you have to have switching off between two individuals, and you have to have it in a way in which you, quote, know that the other one's going to act the proper way, that you can't have it sort of being worked out as you're deciding to leave the egg. Oh, you got to sit on the egg for the next 3 hours. Well, no, I don't want to do it. You go get your own stuff. No, you've got to sit. No, our chicks won't hatch if you don't do it. It can't be done that way. It has to be just automatic. So that's what pair bonding is basically in most cases, where it's simply sort of a fixed behavioral pattern in which two individuals are going to act with respect to each other in a certain way, and that becomes fixed between them, triggered by a variety of means as to why it takes place. Pair bonding, it seems to come into place in humans, is much more complicated. It seems to be what I would refer to as emotional pair bonding, whereas in other species we talk about biological pair bonding. But here's emotional pair bonding, and we know it as love. The two people fall in love with each other. Clearly that's part of our biological heritage. It's there, it happens. We don't know how it happens, so there's a lot of evidence of a lot of things that are going on neurologically during that process. But we also know that pair bonding isn't permanent in this sense. Emotional pair bonding does not establish a permanent relationship between a male and a female. And we know statistically, no matter how you look at it, that it maybe will last about 7 years, sort of at the most on the average, and then the two individuals will no longer be pair bonded with each other. So it's a very different kind of thing that's going on. Secondly, it's also a situation that when it comes into play, it seems to be where a lot of changes had already taken place, particularly with females and their behavior with respect to having offspring. That with all other primates, a female, basically, she has offspring. There may be a few cases where you get pair bonding and males involved in it, but for almost all primates, it's basically she's responsible for her offspring. The male's not going to play a role. His role is to give her, the sex and to provide the sperm. And once he does it, he's out of the picture from his viewpoint and from her viewpoint as well. She doesn't need him. Coming forward to humans, what seemed to be taking place in our evolution was that we were beginning to have situations where the demands on females, for a variety of reasons, the changes in the anatomy with respect to bipedalism, which had effect on the birth canal and thus affecting how much development could be taking place before she has to give birth, and how that relates to selection for a larger brain. But just sort of sum it up, that's what we know is that what seemed to be happening with females was moving more and more in the direction where her time was becoming more and more taken up with taking care of an offspring after it was born. She has to carry it, it can't move on its own, she has to have it with her, etc., so that it becomes more difficult for her to engage in the full range of activity that she needs to do. And it seems to be that in this context, and there's, I think the person's name is Gafford Lay, has a very nice article on looking at under what circumstances is it in a male's interest to shift away from a strategy of trying to be a dominant male and having access to females through dominance, to shifting to what the female wants, which is she wants a male to provide resources to her. And which males are interested in doing that? His argument mathematically is that the males who have been acting in a dominant capacity have no benefit by making that shift. But rather the males who are on the low end of the totem pole from the male viewpoint, the ones who can't get access to females through the dominance hierarchy because they're at the bottom end of the hierarchy, they're the ones where it would be in their interest to shift over in their behavior in terms of what she wants or she needs, which is for him to provision her. And of course, the argument has been made, it's nothing new to make this, that one of the key aspects that seems to be going on between bonding between the male and females in this time period is one through the fact that she has concealed ovulation, so he doesn't know when she's going to be ovulating. So from his viewpoint, if he can be there with her all the time, it's more likely he'll be there when she is ovulating, and that she has more control over the situation as well in terms of being able to control his ability to have sexual access with respect to her. So it looks like what gets is in a situation where you've got this kind of increasing dependence of offspring on the female, and her time has to be devoted more to taking care of the offspring. That those are the situations in which it's in her interest to get males to provision her, and her means for doing it was basically through selection for emotional pair bonding. And so you get pair bonding coming in maybe 300, 400,000 years ago, when all these other things had already been sort of playing themselves out, and she has this, for her, it's in her strong interest to be able to get males to provision her. If I just add one other thing on it, what we know is we're not talking about a male provisioning or caring for offspring in the sense of providing food, because she is nursing her offspring, as we know from primates and chimpanzees, probably up to about 4 to 5 years. So the offspring's food is through her nursing. So the only thing that he can provide is food for her.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I guess that from all of what you just said, we could say that the fact that we evolved such large brains is also behind the evolution of our sociality, because human children really acquired longer periods of development and dependency, and that's what pushed for more parental investment on the part of both women and men, and for pair bonding between them, right?
Yes, yes, and sort of the quote need for a larger brain comes in a number of different ways, not just in terms of obviously just the social side, but we also know on the technological side, we know the kind of changes that were taking place there, and the way in which tools were becoming much more complex in terms of their production, how they're being made, and then presumably how they're being used. So a whole suite of things are going on that all sort of center around a larger brain has a lot of payoff as long as you can afford to have a larger brain. And as one knows in the literature, one has argued about, of course, the large brain is expensive from the viewpoint of running a large brain, the energy that it needs, and also it had those implications with respect to the offspring, the birth of the offspring, that fed back in terms of making for secondary altruism and the offspring more and more dependent upon the female even after birth, right after birth. And all these come into play in terms of sort of pushing for a new kind of social relations between males and females. And not just between the males and females, but sort of background in all this, going back to the chimpanzees, is that the chimpanzees seem to be at best have a sort of marginal solution to the problem of individual behavior. So one solution is what the orangutans did, which is basically don't have a social system, have individuals who are very individualistic, who come together for sex. She has a kid, she takes care of it, he's not involved with it, there is no social domain, and that makes the social world much simpler. But it's not one of just a totally isolation, but rather at least the day-to-day kind of behaviors, you don't have to deal with other individuals. Chimpanzees seem to have solved it to a certain extent, but by a mechanism that's not very effective. It does not have a future to it, which is this heavy dependence on face-to-face interaction to even get a small group to act as a unit, and it doesn't even involve females. You get up to 6 males that can make a social unit on a temporary basis of a few days at best, and you can't build a more complex social world out of temporary social units like that. So what has been absent as you're coming forward to the hominids and to their evolution is, how do you deal with this individualized behavior? Face-to-face interaction doesn't allow you to just do more of it as a solution. It's very costly in terms of time to do that. And there doesn't appear to be any biological solution to how can you have highly individualized behavior and create pro-social behavior at the same time, because the two are antithetical to each other. And that's the argument of saying that something new and different had to come into play. And that's what our hominins, in all the other things that are going on, started to put together, was beginning to understand a way in which one could talk about the relations that one individual has to another, initially within your own group, not on the basis of my face-to-face interaction with them, I know about them for that reason, but beginning to understand the idea that, we have a relation through, well, of course, there's my mother, that's there, and in some sense, that's just part of our biological heritage of being aware of a mother in that sense, and we know that the old world monkeys recognize females in that sense, distinguish between a female and her offspring versus a female and those that are not her offspring. So that's part of, almost part of our hard wiring is we're aware of, somebody being a mother or mothering behavior, because that's what we're engaged in from the moment of birth, kind of thing. And so someplace that gets translated from just simply what's sort of in there in sort of the biological level, but at the cognitive level, it becomes an awareness. Oh, there's a relation that's involved here. The idea of a relation is not just I know she's my mother because she nursed me kind of a thing, but rather that there's kind of this relation of me to her, and not just of me to her, but it's what others also have to that female is nursing them, and begins to come up with this concept of a relation. That is, people are connected to each other by a mother relation. Mm-hmm. And that becomes something new that, of course, does not occur at the primate level. We're having the concept of a relation. Mm-hmm. And the second part of it, and the key thing that had to happen, was to be able to build on that. The idea that, oh, if she is my mother and there's a mother relation between us, then she must also have a relation to another female, and they have a mother relation to each other. So does that mean I have a relationship to that other female, that the mother of my mother is in somehow a relation to me? And that was a critical piece, because that suddenly changes the cognitive world drastically, going away from just saying, okay, on the basis of behavior, I can understand the idea of a relation, being to say, oh, I have a relation to that person because I have a relation to this person, and this person has a relation to that person, so I must have a relation to that person, not because of their behavior, but just because of that idea that a relation generates from me a relation. And that would have been a just incredible breakthrough cognitively in terms of what it allowed to happen. That for the first time you could begin to understand those individuals in my group, not just in fact of day-to-day, face-to-face interaction. I've interacted with you, so I have to understand you and how you behave and all these kinds of things, but begin to say, oh, I'm related to that individual. Oh, I'm related to that individual by this mother relation of a mother relation, and that it's not just I do this, but maybe you're thinking the same things, and the way I think about it can be translated into the way you're thinking about it, and we're all sort of talking about the same thing. And that would have been just an incredible change in terms of what is possible when they made that kind of a breakthrough. And that's the whole argument about saying that there was a qualitative shift, a major shift of a kind that has no roots in the primate behavior level. We have nothing like it at all at the primate level. And for a good reason. I don't know if I want to talk about short-term memory, but it comes back to that issue of the size of short-term memory, that we think of computers as a sort of a model of kind of what cognitive systems are like. One of the things the computer has is a set of registers where information that's stored in memory in the computer has to be brought to a register before it can be acted on by the CPU, by the logical part of the computer. And this seems to be what's going on in human brains as well. That is, we have this incredible ability, it's a huge memory system that's going on. And what we mean by short-term memory is basically the same idea, that something has been taken out of long-term memory, brought into short-term memory, where it is currently being acted on by whatever is the sort of cognitive processing part of the brain. And so the size of that is critical, because if it's, for example, size of only two things, then I can't think of a causal relation like A plus B causes C. Because to think of that, I have to have three things, three slots: the A slot, the B slot, and the consequence slot. Mm-hmm. If I only have two slots, I can't think of that. I can't think of recursion, because recursion requires, again, at least three slots. And so there's whole thing, sort of things that we qualitatively could not do, that are just central to all the things we do cognitively, that we couldn't do with a very small working memory, short-term working memory. And the evidence seems to be that the chimpanzees have a very small short-term working memory. It's size 2, ±1 kind of a thing. And so that this is a whole domain that they simply can't engage in unless there had been selection amongst the chimpanzees for a larger short-term memory. So that becomes a critical piece of it, is saying that there really is a real cognitive basis here for a qualitative shift, going from working memory of size 2 to working memory of size 3 is not just a small quantitative addition, but it is a qualitative difference in terms of subtly making kinds of inferences or thinking about things in a way that you can now do that you could not do before. Mm-hmm. And that comes into play then with the whole notion of relations, because that's dependent upon having a big enough working memory to be able to think in terms of, if I'm related to A is related to B and B is related to C, then I'm related to C. Well, I've got to think about all those things simultaneously to do that.
Mm-hmm. So these sort of cultural kinship terminologies that we create at the cultural level, so at a collective level, of course, and that we transmit to one another culturally and between generations, they are created culturally, but they depend on a set of biological features, like, for example, expanded working memory, and also the capacity for recursion, and also perhaps that happens in us humans and not in other close species like the chimpanzees or the bonobos, because we also have, or at least it seems that we have a more elaborated theory of mind, and it is easier for us to have or to create a sense of self, and also to understand that other people also have their own sense of self, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, all these things are coming into play, and each one of them has its own sort of evolutionary thread as to how they came into the picture, and they may have come in, for a reason not all of them need to come into play from the area of kinship or sort of proto-kinship or starting to move down the kinship track, but might have come in for other things that are also going on that just, with brain exaptation, it takes advantage of the fact, well, if you figured out recursion over in this part of the brain, well, we can just sort of pull it over and now use it over here in this new sort of kinship relation thing, kind of a thing. And for a lot of this, we do have documentation for recursion. We know from the archaeological record, we know when recursion comes in. We know when we have tools that are showing that folks are making them with a sense of recursion. And this only dates back to maybe 300 to 400,000 years ago at most. But before then, there's no indication of any notion of recursion in the technology of making tools. Now, of course, one could say, well, they knew about recursion, they just never applied it in the technological area, but that seems kind of a weak argument. If you can do it, you're going to use it and take advantage of it. And so it looks like something like recursion did not come in until not that far back evolutionarily. 400, 500,000 years ago, we may begin to see recursion coming into play, and it's possible that it might have come in initially, say, in the archaeological domain, in terms of working of tools, and elaboration on that, because we think of, there's a long hiatus with the hand axe. Hand axes started about 1.5 million years ago, carried forward to about 400,000 years ago. A million years in which there's relatively little technological advance in tool making. They're just sitting there making hand axes over and over again, big ones, little ones, out of this kind of stone, out of that kind of stone, going any place in the world, making hand axes. That's making it with the climate, whether you're tropical, forest, whatever. During that time period, folks are just making hand axes, and we don't even know what they were used for. And so it's hard to say why you have this hiatus in technological advancements. A lot of arguments have been made about it. I'll just mention one, I don't necessarily want to push it, would come back to the question of working memory, that you are pushing the upper bounds of working memory to be able to make hand axes, which is already conceptually quite complex. A lot of archaeologists have talked about it, and it is itself is a complex thing to be making. And if you're working at the edge, sort of the boundary of working memory, just to be able to make a hand axe, then one could say, well, it looks like it's possible that the reason you stayed with hand axes is it did take a long time to get any further increase in working memory, and maybe it didn't occur except in some other domain that you got that change, and then it paid off in the technological area as well. So probably a lot of these sort of interrelations between what's happening in one domain that might push one aspect, and another domain pushing another, and then being exapted or taken over by another domain in terms of sort of all building it together. But it seems to be is that coming together with this concept of kinship relations, is the one thing that is resolving the issue of individualized behavior. Because when you say, I am related to that individual, and I understand something about how that person is going to behave, because one of the aspects of kinship systems is they carry with them the presumption of altruistic behavior. Not that you are altruistic, but the presumption is that your kin are going to act altruistically. And Meyer Fortis made this argument a long time ago in terms of an axiom of kinship, which is basically the prescriptive altruism. We expect our kin to act altruistically to us as kin. And if they don't act altruistically, then we get upset about their behavior, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you don't need biology there, but rather you just need that part of this developing kinship concept is altruistic behavior. And it makes good sense, because where does it start out? It starts out with the mother relation, biological mother, tons of selection for mothering behavior, which is as altruistic as you can get. She is putting time and energy for the benefit of her offspring. Now, of course, it feeds back on your own fitness, but so someone might argue, well, that's not really altruism. Well, in a sense, all altruism eventually sort of feeds back someplace on somebody who's benefiting from it. But that's part of the mothering behavior. It's not just simply you're recognizing a relation. You're recognizing a relation with behavior. Behavior that is positive, supportive, non-selfish, emotional, all these kinds of things that are part of what's built into mothering behavior. So it's not a far cry to say that as one begins to build up, a mother of a mother is a relation, is an expectation that a mother of a mother is going to have similar kinds of behavior, or should have similar kinds of behavior. And if that's happening with this sort of building up the idea of, I connect myself to this other individual through relations, and we also have expectations of behavior, altruistic behavior, we've got now a new device, which is saying, I don't have to interact with you first. I just need to know you're this kind of relation. You're my mother's brother. And because you're my mother's brother, I expect you to act in this way. And if you don't act in this way, I can complain to your others that we were connected to and say, you're not acting, this guy's not acting right. I did A, B, and C, and he acted the following way, and that's not how a relation should behave. And they say, oh, you're right, that's not how he should behave. And so he gets punished for his behavior. You can induce punishment in the sense of making him sort of socially correct behavior. So when you have that, you can both simultaneously maintain the biological substrate of individualized behavior, which we have coming up clearly in humans, but now you have another system that is overriding that individualized behavior and saying, regardless of your individualized behavior, I've got expectations about how you should act because you and I agree on this kinship system, which also causes you to know back to me reciprocally that I'm linked to you, and we each have expectations of our behavior, how I expect you to act and how you expect me to act. And so they've got a very powerful system that is now saying, how do we get pro-social behavior taking place without it requiring extensive face-to-face interaction first for somebody to understand how another individual is going to act? I don't have to do that. I can just know, oh, you're my relation. Because you're my relation, I expect you to act this way. You don't act this way? Well, I'm going to complain to all these other folks who are just going to tell you that's a bad way to act, kind of a thing. And so that becomes an enormously powerful system.
So, in a sense, we could say, in a sense, we could say that these kinship terminologies that each human society creates serve the function of both reducing uncertainty in terms of creating expectations to the sort of behavior that we could expect from other people with whom we have some sort of relationship, a kin relationship, of course, and also to promote social cohesion in a way, right? Because I mean, we know in a sense how we should behave toward other people and vice versa.
Yeah. Well, let me give a very concrete example. My wife and I were visiting one of her relations, or a distant relation in England. So this is somebody that she had not had contact with, or rather say, she might have had some contact with her when the person in question was 4 or 5 years old, for very briefly. So to all intents and purposes, they had not had any contact with each other. So she was now an adult woman, married, had children who were also adults. None of whom my wife had not had any contact with any of them. I had never had any contact with them. I was a total stranger to them. I was a total stranger to them. And so we went up to the door, we knocked on the door, and they opened it and says, oh, and my wife says, oh, I'm so-and-so, you're blah, blah, blah. And I said, oh, welcome, come in, come in. And we had a great visit. We talked about this and that, caught up on history that none of us started doing anything about. And I knew nothing about. They found out about me and all these kinds of things. Now imagine I had knocked on any other door in the same neighborhood, knocked on the next door over, next house next door, knocked on the door, they answered, and I said, oh, I am blah, blah, blah. Would they have invited me in, and would they have led to this sort of long social conversation with them? No. They'd have said, get out of here, I'm going to call the police. The sole difference was establishing, oh, we don't know each other, but we do know we're kin to each other. And so now we know something about each other. And so that changed it from a stranger, possibly threatening relationship to a warm, supportive relationship just by introducing the fact that, oh, you're my kin. And this is what our human kin systems are doing. They're making it possible for people to determine, are you and I kin to each other? Of course, the ones I already know to be kin, I already know about them. I mean, in the group, I know about all the ones I've grown up with, I know what my kin are, kind of a thing. But what about somebody I never met before? Is this my kin, or is this not my kin? If it's not my kin, or a stranger, then if I'm a hunter-gatherer, I will consider them as dangerous. If they're my kin, that's a whole different matter. That changes our behavior entirely. How do I know that they're my kin? How do I figure this out? And that was the genius of our ancestors, probably about 35 to 40,000 years ago, was to work out a symbolic system of kin relations, what we refer to as kin terms, with an underlying structural logic to it. A system sort of like one thinks about, adding numbers with symbols. We have that whole symbolic system of adding numbers. We don't have to have physical objects. If I would add 2 plus 5, I don't have to have 2 marbles over here and 5 marbles over there, put the 2 together and count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. I can just say, oh, the symbol 2 plus the symbol 5 is the symbol 7. And I know that that would work in terms of counting. Same thing has happened here, that our ancestors figured out how to have a symbolic system in which one could be able to compute kin relations of individuals to each other. And a very simple device. If I have a kin relation to that person over there, and you have a kin relation to that person over there, and if we share the same kinship terminology system, we can know what kin relation then we have to each other.
Right.
So incredible device.
And what's the upper limit where kin systems start breaking down? I mean, because I know that hunter-gatherer societies or tribes, they are composed usually of different residence groups. So is it the case that each resident group has a specific kin system, or is it the same for the entire hunter-gatherer society?
Okay, one thing that comes out of it is the idea that for it to work, the ones I'm interacting with need to be individuals who share the same kinship terminology system that I have. Because if you have a kinship terminology system and I have one, we don't know each other's, we know nothing about them. It's just that idea of how do we work this out wouldn't work. We all have to be sharing the same thing, which says that the reason hunters and gatherers are all composed of folks who are kin to each other is not just a curious observation, but it's absolutely central for that system to work. They have to be kin to each other. And the only people you can have as part of your system are those who are either kin to you or that you know that they are kin to you. And then we can say, okay, from that viewpoint, how big of a group are we talking about? Well, we know that the residence group is around 25 or 30 individuals, regardless of where they're located. A certain number comes up over and over again in terms of that. There's been this notion that hunter-gathering societies are bounded by around 600 individuals, but nobody's had a good sort of argument as to why are you bounded with about 600. But if you then say, okay, if the world, my world, are those that I know are my kin or that I compute are my kin, okay, I've got my kin relations to everybody in my group. That's 25 people. And let's say that the maximum dispersal, or every person in this group has a kin relationship to some other group of 25. So to everybody in my group, then every one of these individuals, let's say, is connected to altogether 25 other groups. And since I know the kin relationship to the person in my group, and that person knows the kin relationship they have to in that group over there, that I can compute my kin relationship to everybody in that other group, even though I've never met these people before in my life. I would just sit down and say, oh, you're my blah, 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 because blah, blah, blah. Say, oh, yes, absolutely. Great, fantastic, glad to see you. Share our resources. We're glad to have you here, kind of a thing. Mm-hmm. But that's as far as you can do it. Mm-hmm. And to do it one more step out, that you do initially 25, and for those 25, another 25, but to carry another step out would involve very complicated calculations of having to calculate in between people that somehow you're using to connect together. So it's limited by 2 steps. And if I've got 25 people in my group, and each of those most can contact 25 other people, 25 other groups, each of 25, then altogether our kin world is 25 times 25 equals 625. So now we have an understanding of why the heck hunting-gathering groups are bounded by about 600 individuals, because that's the biggest group you can have. They can actually compute kin relations to each other, and the group has to be one that they can actually compute kin relations to each other, because that's the only way they can relate to each other socially is to know they're kin to each other. Mm-hmm. And so it is bounded. So that kinship system is then bounded. Of course, that's an order of magnitude bigger than what you could do with primates. With primates, you have a troop or a community. The community is sort of an odd thing because it can have maybe 80 to 100 individuals, but it's never a social unit. The community never comes together. But it's sort of kind of this weird thing that's between little small social units that you can make, individuals by themselves kind of thing, but it's never a community. Troops, 25 to 30 individuals. So going from troops to hunters and gatherers is order of magnitude bigger. It's a huge jump that was able to come about by virtue of you had a system that made it possible to say, okay, I know not only the people of my own group, but as long as somebody in my group is connected to somebody over there, then I know my kin relationship to all those people over there, and they all know their kinship relation back to me. And because we're sharing the same kinship terminology to do this, we're also part of the same sort of cultural domain, have the same understanding about these kin relations and how kin should be behaving to each other. If I expect you to act in this way because you're that kind of a kin, you have the understanding that that is the way you should be reacting because you're that kind of kin back to me. And so we understand each other in terms of expected behaviors on the basis of having kin relations to each other. And as long as we can work out those kin relations, then we can evoke those expected behaviors. If we can't work out the kin relations, then we just fall back to, you're a stranger, and I don't know what you're going to do. You're possibly going to kill me. Rasmussen has a tremendous example for the Inuit in terms of what would happen during the winter time when they would break camp and go from one camp to another. And this would be in the winter with seeding camps where you'd have a number of different males together to catch seals, and they had to have about 25 males to do this. And so you'd have males that had very distant or very weak kin relations to each other as part of that group. So it wasn't a sort of close-knit group of folks that everybody knew everybody kind of a thing, but rather it was, you had folks that ostensibly were like strangers to each other, but they did know they were kin to each other, so that made it work. In the wintertime, they're breaking camp to go to another location, walking single file, and Rasmussen talks about his informer and say, when doing that, if you had to take a pee, you didn't dare step out of line to take a pee in the snow because the man behind you might not know what you're doing. And if he doesn't know what you're doing, it is safer for him to kill you than take the risk that maybe you stood out of line because you wanted to kill him. And that was the kind of fear they had of even distant kin. Mm-hmm. And if you talk about strangers, ones who are not kin to you at all, when you say, hey, strangers, we just don't deal with strangers. They're dangerous, they're fearful. And so that becomes a real boundary. And so again, it's saying that it works because you've got a set of individuals with a shared culture. The system requires that it has to be a shared culture in order to be able for it to work. And it's a bounded system of about 600 individuals because that's the biggest you can put together this way.
Mm-hmm. So the shared culture, or perhaps we could call it in a sense a cultural identity or a group identity, when we go beyond that number of 600 individuals or so, we need to develop other sorts of group identity to promote cooperation among people that are part of the same society. I mean, it's we can no longer rely exclusively on kin systems. Right?
Yes, and the next huge invention that came into play was the idea of a lineage system. The notion of saying, you and I are connected to each other because we can both trace back to this guy over here or to this woman over here. And that gives us a relationship to each other, whether or not we can work out a kin relationship to each other. Because once you came up with that idea, and of course it requires not just talking about living individuals. Now, of course, with our hunters and gatherers working with their kinship system, they do not need to refer to anybody in the past. They're not worried about genealogical relations. That was the beauty of the kinship terminology system, is you don't need to know the genealogical relations that are involved. It doesn't make any difference what they are. All you have to know is the kin term relation, and you can work out your kin term relation. That makes the whole thing work. So you have to worry about the genealogy. Now, the problem with genealogy is you have to go back and come forward in order to go horizontal. To get somebody distantly of your generation, but as a distant relative, you have to go back many generations to find a common ancestor that you have and the other person has as well. And of course, you have to go back many generations. You have to refer to dead people. You have to keep track of the dead. You can't just forget about them. So the problem with them, with the genealogical system, is just that. Well, but by this time, once you've got hunters and gatherers, you've got this whole kinship system working. That's a cultural system in terms of everybody's sort of working within this kind of framework. And expanding it to, and we also know that certainly by this time that the notion of the dead and the dead in some sense being kept track of is very much part of this, because we know how far back burials go in terms of human history. It goes back, maybe 40 or 50,000 years ago, we started picking up burials, and certainly by about 30,000, there are a lot of burials. We're talking about Homo sapiens. And maybe this is why people were burying. That it may have been that they ran into this difficulty when they were first trying to put together a system initially based just on genealogy, because that would be the first sort of way to try to do it. The mother of my mother, the mother of my father, the father of my mother kind of thing, or the child of my mother's child, working on these genealogical relations, and ran into the difficulty in the fact that you couldn't do very much beyond your own group and a few individuals unless you're also keeping track of dead people. And now suddenly you've got a premium on trying to keep track of dead people. There might be certain dead people that turn out to be kind of critical in terms of working out relations. And so one can begin to imagine maybe one of the reasons folks started coming up with the idea of burying the dead was for something mundane, like we got to keep track of them. And one way to keep them in memory is to have a whole ceremony about when they die, kind of thing. That's another matter. But what happened with lineage systems, by the time you're talking about hunters and gatherers, is making that kind of a shift. You've got all the machinery in place. You just have to have a need for implementing it, which is basically the notion that we'll say, okay, we'll trace back in ancestry back to this guy way back here or this woman way back here, and all the folks that are tracing back to that person through a single sex, either through fathers or through mothers. And of course, why doing it through a single sex is otherwise it's not a very very complicated system. If you have both kinds of tracing, it's much simpler if you do it by one sex alone, because then it makes for nice, distinct groups. That this made for then a way of expanding the kinship world. That you and I are linked to each other not because we know anything about our kinship relationship to each other, which may not even exist. We have no idea what it is, but because we both recognize tracing back to a particular ancestor, and everybody in our group also recognizes they trace back to that ancestor. And so we all know that we're all linked to each other because of that. And once you do that, you then open it up to a whole different world in terms of how big could the social world be.
Mm-hmm. So perhaps let's just explore one last topic here, because it seems to me it's obvious, I guess, that these skin systems that people create vary cross-culturally and among societies. Particularly, we're talking here about hunter-gatherer societies. We could also include, I think, horticultural societies. But anyway, the ways these skin systems vary, is it arbitrary or random? Because wouldn't it be the case that the way by which each society comes up with a kinship system, that it would depend at least to a certain extent on the ecological circumstances they are exposed to, and perhaps the kinds of activities, economic activities that they develop, and things like that?
Yeah, that's the sort of initial expectation we would have. And that, of course, within anthropology, one goes back to kinship studies, was the way people were sort of starting out. That is, with Morgan, it was initially assuming that it had to come out of marriage rules. But when that kind of began to clear, that wasn't going to solve the question of why we get these different terminologies. There was that kind of expectation, well, if we do a classification of systems of social organization, a classification of terminologies, we ought to see a fit between them, that in some way the terminology works with a particular kind of social organization, or maybe in terms of ecological conditions. Well, maybe all the folks in tropical areas have this kind of terminology, all the one in the Arctic have that kind, but none of those worked out. So it's more complicated than that. And the answer to the question is still wide open. It's a good question to do research on. But let me just offer some possibilities here. So we know if once we begin to say, okay, what a terminology is a system that has its own logic in terms of how it's put together. You start out with sort of primary kin relations and have a way of joining them together by kin term products. I call you mother, you call that person somebody, then I call that person by, and come up with a kin term for that other person, kind of thing. Then once you start saying, okay, that's what a terminology is, it's put together in this kind of a way, in a logical way, in this manner. How many different ways are there of doing this, just from a logical viewpoint? And there we get some interesting variation that takes place. That one way ends up with what Morgan called the descriptive terminologies. Another way of doing it ends up with what he called the classitory terminologies. And within the classitory terminologies, there are also some other variations that can take place in how you put it together. You can do it this way, and you end up with Australian kinship systems. And do it that way, you end up with Dravidian systems from India. Put it together another way, and we get up with Polynesian terminologies. And do a variant on the Australian ones, and you end up with the Iroquois ones. So we can understand this variation that takes place just from a logical viewpoint of possibilities in terms of constructing a terminology. At this point in the construction, you could do it this way, or you could do it that way. If you do it this way, it'll lead to this kind of terminology. If you do it that way, you'll do a different kind of terminology. So that's one thought. Second one is when we look at hunters and gatherers. I mean, I taught a course in hunters and gatherers and we used 4 different groups throughout the world. One was the Hung-San from the Kalahari Desert in Africa. One was the Silik Inuits from the Arctic region. Another was the Tiwi from Australia. And the fourth one, I forget exactly how I'm blanking on the fourth one, but there was a fourth one. The Kuya Indians of California, who had a tribal-like system as hunters and gatherers by virtue of having a resource, acorns, that was comparable to having like an agricultural resource in the sense that it was something that just came in huge quantities and you could take advantage of that, and they were doing that. 4 groups, 4 different kinds of terminologies, 4 different parts of the world. But if you look at any one of these parts of the world and expand it on it, you would not necessarily find just a replication of any one of these. So there's a lot of variation that's taking place. It doesn't seem to relate to anything specific like ecological conditions, systems of social organization, or the like, which were original expectations. So one possibility is that this variation may be nothing more than that folks are putting together a terminology, and for just purely historical reasons, they did it this way as opposed to that way. And when they did it that way, then that just got done over and over again as they expanded in numbers. They just sort of did more and more of that. And so it may be that the difference between, say, the hunting-gathering terminologies in Australia versus the Polynesian ones has nothing to do with ecology or anything like that, but just due to the historical background that the ancestral group that gave rise to the Polynesians had put together a terminology in a particular way, and they could have done it a different way, but they didn't. And so that became sort of the basis of what they had as they expanded into the oceanic area. You just simply get multiplication of that kind of terminology. So that's a possibility that one can't exclude. It may not have an adaptive consequence. It may not be that folks are in that adaptive sense putting together terminology in a particular way. Now, there are some where it does look like that's what's happening. The Crow-Omaha terminologies have always been sort of problematic to everybody in terms of these terminologies that are mirror images of each other. Strong association with lineal systems. They almost always occur with a lineal system. Why? Well, one possibility is we look at the generative logic of Crow-Omaha terminologies. It looks like, and here I'm going to go on a limb because this is just sort of stuff that's worked on recently and haven't explored enough to really say what's really correct or not. But one possibility is that, and I know it's for the Omaha, it works out pretty well, and I think for the Crow, is that basically these are Iroquois terminologies where they have added onto it equations that are changing some of the kin term relations in the Iroquois terminology. And what they're doing in is basically reducing sort of the other lineage. We've always got a problem in a lineal system, of an exogamous lineal system. I'm marrying somebody from a different lineage. Okay, so we marry each other. We got rules about where the kids belong to my lineage or your lineage, kind of a thing. But you've always got this kind of other lineage there that's kind of a bother from the one that actually is going to have control over the kids. The one that's going to have control of the kids doesn't really want the other lineage around in a sense, because any claims that they're trying to make by virtue of I got a spouse, that's married to you, and you may claim the kids for you, but that's your spouse is from our lineage, and she is still a member of our lineage. She didn't change lineages when she got married to you. She's still a member of our lineage, and therefore we like to make claims kinds of things and blah, blah, blah. That's always sort of, in a way, is kind of a problem with the lineal system, is you've got that other lineage that's always there, and it doesn't sort of help you with things. It's acting in the way. And particularly it's in the way in matrilineal systems between males, because you've got in a matrilineal system, the lineage says the male who has control over the kids is the mother's brother, because it's always assigned to the male, and then it's going to be the mother's brother. And what about the guy? The guy is like to make claims over the kids because he's the one that impregnated her, and they're his kids, kind of a thing. And so we know in that lineal system, they do a lot of things that are a way of just kind of downplaying any claims that he could make over where they're going to reside. or they might reside with him, but then when they get a certain age, they have to go back to the lineage that they're going to become part of, to the mother's brother kind of thing. It's not as problematic in the patrilineal systems for that, but we can see that groups are always dealing with that in terms of the fact in lineal systems, you've got two lineages you have to deal with, and they don't have mutual interests. And how do you deal with that? One way to say what's going on with the Chrome, while terminologies may be, is that basically you came up with these skewing rules that are designed to reduce, from the terminological viewpoint, the importance of the other lineage. Reduce it down to its minimum. Basically, reduce it down to, okay, you got your lineage over there. We're only going to recognize two positions in that lineage, a male position and a female position, and everybody in that lineage is going to be called by those two positions, regardless of their genealogical relationships to each other. And so that translates into these odd skewings where you say, oh, the father, sister, son is called a father, kind of thing. Why do they call a father, sister, son, a father? Well, if you think of it not in terms of genealogy, but just in terms of interests, we don't want these folks to be able to do very much. We want to reduce their linkages to us. Let's reduce them down to a minimum, down to two positions. And from our viewpoint in the terminology, there's already two positions, and no matter what's going on genealogically, they're either this one or they're that one, and that's it. And so that's one way of looking at it, is saying this was a case much more along the lines of how does one deal with this kind of fundamental problem of lineal systems, which what do you do with the other lineage? One of them is to deal with it terminologically. So there are possibilities like this that can come into play where the sort of adaptive aspects may come into play, not necessarily for the terminology as a whole, but it might have to do with some aspect of the terminology.
Mm-hmm. So that's very interesting. So anthropologists, or in this case, I guess, cultural anthropologists, haven't really been able to identify any sort of patterns cross-cultural patterns in terms of kin systems and associate them with any sort of recurring variables, ecological or other sort of variables. Is that the case?
That is the case. No, that has not worked. There's been no sort of clear pattern. Any sort of pattern anybody's come up with and said, well, I've looked at A, B, C, and D, and they're all cases of this. I think that's the cause of that. And some immediately come along and say, but you didn't look at G, H, and I over here who got the same terminology, but they don't have any of the conditions that you say are the cause of the terminology, nonetheless they have the same terminology. But that's what happens over and over again with attempts to do that. It just hasn't worked. But I think part of the difficulty is because one has worked with terminologies not from the viewpoint of their, if you like to say a language analogy, not from the viewpoint of the grammar, but rather from the consequence of the grammar. If we were, for example, looking at verbs in English and just trying to talk about verbs, well, of course, we know we've got irregular verbs and regular verbs, and then we can talk about the grammar underlying it in terms of this, that, and the other thing. But if we didn't know anything about the grammar, didn't talk about it, we're just talking to the superficial level of different verbs and verb forms, we might be making sort of patterns out of this in terms of sort of ecological reasons why you have these kinds of verbs or that kind of verbs kind of thing, where what you're missing is where these things are coming from in the first place. That if you're going to talk about sort of adaptation, you don't want to do it so much at the superficial level of the final consequence, but you want to sort of push it downward in terms of, okay, where does that come from, and where does adaptation sort of come into the picture? If it truly is only at the very top end of it, then we're talking about some fairly superficial things. If it's kind of much deeper down there and say, okay, from the grammar we know that A, B, and C is going on, and it looks like some aspects of this grammar relate to some other things that are going on, then we have a better understanding. We have the problem is we don't have grammars of kinship terminologies. People are working off the level of just knowing the final product. We've got the kin terms, and all the classifications were based on simplistic notions of what pattern do you have in terms of kin terms. So the Eskimo terminologies were defined by those terminologies that don't make a distinction in terms of uncles and aunts between whether it's matrilineal or patrilineal. And similar kind of thing with cousins. Well, yes, that's true, but you can have those properties arising for completely different reasons. One of my examples of this is the way the Kung San terminology is called an Eskimo terminology. Now, you would think if the terminology is like our own, as Eskimo is what we have, English terminology is also an Eskimo terminology, so we can use ours as a prototype of an Eskimo terminology. You would think if you're calling something Eskimo terminology, you'd be able to say, oh yeah, I can see some similarities between our terminology and their terminology because we're both Eskimo terminologists. Try to teach students about the Kung San terminology, and they can't figure out anything that's going on with it. That makes absolutely no sense to them whatsoever. There's no connection between the two. It's sort of like a classification that puts it into this pile for reasons totally unrelated to anything that's going on within the terminology itself. Well, kind of the difficulty then is if you've got is sorting things out this way and say, well, do the Eskimo terminologies occur under these conditions, and your classification is already a grab bag, then even if you've got a valid adaptation argument, at least for some of them, it may be that the ones that are the counterexamples really should never have been there in the first place. They were just it's a bad classification. So it's just an area that just needs to be, redone and rethought and reworked out. So I don't want to eliminate the possibility of adaptation in the sense of saying there may be some, find out if we do it at the structural level of what are the differences in structures. Why did these people choose to put it together this way? Maybe it does have something to do with something that's going on in their society that actually works better than if they were to have done it a different way. It may not be just a historical accident they did it this way, but maybe that it has some real consequences in terms of this. But in doing that, we want to make sure that the things we're talking about are things that are really of the same note, the same kind, not for superficial reasons, but because we worked out the grammar, and now we know that these terminologies are sharing the same grammar. Now, does that grammar then play itself out in a certain way in terms of whatever we want to relate it to? And that, I think, would be a more useful way to try to address those questions.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
but it requires...
yes? Sorry?
It requires going back to redoing a lot of work that's already been done in terms of beginning to work out and say, well, we really need to work out better what are the different terminology structures that we have in terminologies worldwide. It's not a huge number. There's only a finite number of possibilities, and that finite number is not too terribly large because there's really only, as you generate a terminology, there's only a few places where you've got variations that you can make. And the number of variants isn't very big. So it's not like a totally open-ended kind of thing of combinatorial explosion that you could have. That's the problem with genealogy, is the genealogy relations are a combinatorial explosion. Every step you go, you double the number of possibilities. And so as you go out in more steps, you're going out to have astronomical numbers of possibilities. It's not true of terminologies. It's a much more sane, bounded world. So we can work out all the different structures and then begin to sort it out in that sense. Okay, now we've got the structures worked out. Now we're in a better position to ask these other kinds of questions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very well. So, Dr. Read, just before we go, I'm going to leave links in the description box of the interview for your books and the rest of your work. But are there any good places on the internet for people to find your work if they want to?
They can search under my name, either under ResearchGate or under academia.
Mm-hmm.
And searching my name under academia, ResearchGate, they will then get, and I try to put everything I published on those locations with copies of all articles and not books. I can't put the books there, but the articles are there.
Okay, very well. So I will be leaving also that in the description box of the video. And Dr. Read, it was again a real pleasure to have you on the show, and it was really a fascinating conversation. So thank you a lot again for taking the time.
Okay, Ricardo, I thank you for inviting me, and I enjoyed being able to talk with you.
Hi there, thank you for coming to my channel and for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Otherwise, I also have PayPal and Subscribestar. And if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons, Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condreano, Janne Henninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, and Dr. Jerry Muller, Herbert Gintis, and Rutger Voss, and also my three producers, Isar Webbe, Rosie, and Jim Frank. Thank you for all.